The Vale Gallery faced the square with that thin, correct smile that belongs to houses which have known money for generations and do not particularly wish to be reminded of it. Its windows, curtained in a pale dove grey, gave nothing away. Inside, however, the rooms had been coaxed into a kind of twilight at 6 o'clock, so that the paintings might produce their own illumination. A discreet orchestra, 2 violins and a cello, braided a Handel air with the murmur of voices, and in the high, narrow hall, a butler moved in the soundless manner of men who are known by their gloves. They had come early, some of them, to avoid the later crush, those who are afraid of being jostled, those who possess names that open doors and do not like to be kept waiting by their own privilege, those, too, who simply wished to look. They stood with their backs to the walls and considered the canvases in the manner of persons failing to recognize a friend seen out of context. "They're quite dark," said Lady Honoria Vale, standing beside a long hydrangea in a white porcelain urn. She was tall, with a pleasant habit of making conversation sound like an aside to herself. "One must be careful with dark pictures. They begin to believe themselves profound." "The show is called Nocturnes, my dear," said Sir Julian Quain, whose voice was a contralto drawl that gave everything he said a trifling air of rehearsal. "Nocturnes cannot reasonably be expected to beam." "Mr. Dacre's women do not beam," put in Mr. Mordaunt, the critic, with a small smile that did its best to be unobserved and failed. "They look out from the canvas as if someone called them by their old names and they would rather not turn." Crispin Dacre, the painter, had not yet arrived to answer this. The corners of his canvases, mounted in black frames with a dull gold lip, glimmered like the edges of playing cards in a magician's hand. The women Mr. Mordaunt referred to lounged in the half-light of imagined rooms, their hands, astonishingly real and faintly theatrical hands, drawn with an emphasis that verged upon the unnerving. A single white glove lay on a table in one painting, and in another a candle guttered in an invisible draught, and a hand hovered, parted from its body by the painter's cunning, above the flame. A girl with pale hair in a simple dress, too simple for the place and therefore a calculation, stood not far from the hydrangea, biting her lower lip and pretending not to look at one particular canvas. She had the deliberate innocence that accompanies actresses in their 4th season. Imogen Lethbridge had brought a gust of the theatre with her, an air of dressing rooms and extinguished lights and the sudden intimacy of strangers. She spoke to a young man with an unimpeachable necktie and an air of being handsome under supervision. "Yes," she said, "it is rather unlike me. Or rather, it is the sort of likeness people always think is unlike." The young man, addressed by someone as Montfort and by others as Deborah's cousin, said with sincerity that he did not pretend to know about art. The sincerity did him no harm. He looked at the picture, a large one, in which a woman tilted her head so that the light ran along the throat and stained the ear, and then at Imogen, and blushed violently at his own careful comparison. "It is not me," Imogen said, relieving him. "Of course people will say it is. Mr. Dacre never paints a portrait that is not a portrait of a world he cares to arrange." "You mean," said Mr. Mordaunt, appearing as smoothly as if conjured from the shadow of his own opinion, "that Mr. Dacre paints his women in rooms where they are always about to be overheard." He bowed to Imogen. "Miss Lethbridge." "Mr. Mordaunt," said Imogen, and the light touch on the syllables suggested that she had decided he would not be allowed to hurt her, and if he tried, she would laugh. Across the room, a retired general, with a chest like a mantelpiece and the expression of a man who had found all the chairs in the room unsuitable, was explaining, with that curious politeness cultivated by army men when faced with art, that one could make out the subject if one stood far enough away. "You see, Lady Honoria," said General Bracknell, "from this distance that is a hand. From a nearer one it has pretensions to being a bird. One ought never to give hands ideas above their station." Lady Honoria, who had never commanded troops but had managed 2 committees and 3 husbands, smiled with indulgence and turned to the butler. "Mr. Pym," The lamps are a trifle jealous. Do keep them pacified. We shall have a panic if they begin to sulk." Mr. Pym had already done whatever was necessary. He was small, precise, and possessed a sobriety of manner that suggested he took refreshment from the notion of exactness. He moved like a metronome between groupings of guests and small tempers. He murmured to the footman. He altered a candle's height. He removed a glass from a frayed edge of carpet before the carpet could assert itself. In the doorway, two late arrivals were admitted together, one with the unremarkable ease of a man accustomed to being at home in rooms he has never seen before, and the other with a grace that noticed everything and owned none of it. Troy Allen, wearing a dress that managed, without any pressure, to make those near her look fussy, took her husband's arm for a moment and then left it as one might leave a chair, with the suggestion she would come back when he had finished with it. Inspector Roderick Allen, invited to admire paintings and obliged, perhaps, to do his duty at a later hour, looked around him with that pleasure he sometimes indulged in the presence of good arrangement. The orchestra finished its bar and began again. The air was mild with polish, flowers, people, and the faint print of the street outside. He smiled at Lady Honoria and was presented to Mr. Dacre, who had slipped in on their wake. "Mr. Dacre," said Lady Honoria, "Inspector Allen is reluctantly inured to paintings. His wife has accustomed him to them." She turned her head. "Troy, my dear." Troy came at once, as if the room had turned towards her. "Crispin," she said, and shook hands as though their fingers were repeating an old step. "You found your knight." "Night is forgiving," Dacre said. He had a pale, inward face and eyes that watched everyone as if he expected them to mislay themselves. "Troy, your last show taught me something about edges. One must respect where something stops." "And where it seems to stop," Troy said with an amused glance at a trailing brush mark. "And where one wants it to stop. Roderick, Mr. Dacre." Alain found himself liking the painter against his will. The man possessed that agreeable diffidence that masks a prouder nature and a touch of mischief. "You compel people to look," Alain said, "which I should have thought the first duty of a painter and the last of a policeman." "Does one compel them?" Dacre asked, turning his head, and for the briefest second Alain saw that the man was counting something. Footfalls, perhaps, or the number of times the orchestra returned to its theme. "Not always," Alain said. "Sometimes one lets them feel they discovered it." "Mr. Dacre," said Mr. Mordaunt, drifting forward to make a triangle, "there is a piece in the third room which seems to suggest to some that you have been unkind to Miss Lethbridge." Dacre's face closed and opened with a politeness that had very little to do with its owner. "Miss Lethbridge," he said without turning, "doesn't require my kindness. She has talent and a presentiment of herself. She suffers from neither mercy nor exact likenesses." Imogen, who had approached them during this, smiled at Alain. "Inspector, we met once in the wings at the Wexley when Troy was looking for a door that didn't squeak." "I've never met a door," Troy said, "that didn't squeak when it wished to express an opinion." "Miss Lethbridge," murmured General Bracknell from behind her shoulder, "these rooms are unfit for purpose. One cannot get a view. Lady Honoria, believe me, galleries should be large enough to sit a regiment." "They never are," said Lady Honoria, composed. "That is their point." A waiter offered a tray. Imogen took a glass but did not drink. Dacre watched her not drinking. Alain watched Dacre watching it. And Mr. Mordaunt, who believed he watched everything, watched Allen. "Felix is late," Lady Honoria remarked, and there was a small stir in the conversation around her name for Mr. Felix Sarson, who arranged such evenings on behalf of painters and their patrons, and arranged, too, the delicate business of payment. "He'll tell me the fog has ambitions to be a character." "He will have been detained by adoration," Mr. Mordaunt said. "It is his business to hold doors. Sometimes he forgets on which side of the threshold he stands." Sir Julian, standing by, made a sound of amused assent. He will have been detained by the sight of someone else detained. He cannot resist a cue. "Mr. Pym," Lady Honoria said, "when Mr. Sarson arrives, send him to me. We must perform our little ritual before the hour." Alain turned to Troy, who understood at once. Lady Honoria's ritual. "On the stroke of 7, Troy said, "she has the artist blow out one candle. It's a silly thing, but the collectors adore it. It gives them the impression they bought the last of the light." "Rituals," Alain said, "do concentrate attention, or they distract it." "You are at work," Troy said softly, so that only he heard. "Or you might be." "I am at dinner," said Alain, "but one cannot tell whether the soup was made in a clean saucepan." In the second room, a white plaster hand on a velvet cushion received a number of more or less daring comments. It was a cast, evidently, of a woman's hand, the fingers long but not overly slender, the nails free of polish, a slight ridging of knuckle visible where the plaster had settled. A ring lay upon the cushion beside it, as if the hand, exhausted by symbol, had taken it off. Alain looked at it and felt that small tap one sometimes experiences when the world touches lightly upon one's sleeve. "Crispin," Troy said, "is the cast yours?" "I borrowed it," Dacre said. "It is the hand of a model who no longer sits. She married and became real." "Generous," said Mr. Mordaunt from nowhere, "to allow herself to be dismembered for art." Dacre did not answer. Imogen, who had come with the others, touched the rim of the velvet with one finger and drew it back as if it had been warmer than velvet should be. General Bracknell, for his part, looked at the plaster and said that, in his day, one shook a hand before one took it. "Crispin likes to tease," said Sir Julian to Lady Honoria. "He knows very well this hand will be discussed in taxis for a week. He might have saved himself the canvases and simply shown the hand in 12 positions like a ballet. I should have directed it. One could call it gesture, and have done. Felix," Mr. Pym said quietly into Lady Honoria's ear, and a man in a very correct dinner jacket and a slightly too handsome face presented himself with an apology in it that did not reach his eyes. "My dear Honoria," he said, "forgive me. The fog has ambitions. I detained it with the promise of a better part later." "We shall perform our candle," said Lady Honoria. "You see how I save you from your own metaphors." "Will everyone come in?" Mr. Pym said, not loudly. And they did, trickling as if pulled by a skein of silk, into the first room again, where the orchestra came down to a softer thing and the footman became part of the furniture. Lady Honoria lifted one of the candles from its sconce and held it like a small, tame star. Dacre took it from her, and together they stood beneath the central canvas. A room at night, a great window, a figure apart, half turned, its hand upon the glass, as if to test whether the cold was real. Alain felt in that moment before the flame went out, the room remember something. He saw Troy, her head a little to one side, smiling because art pleased her when it forgot itself. He saw Imogen, whose eyes had grown larger, as if in the dark she might see herself more clearly. He saw General Bracknell, stolid, indulgent, and uneasy. Sir Julian, amused. Mr. Mordaunt, hungry. Mr. Sarson, appraising. Mr. Pym, exact. Dacre blew softly. The candle made a last small theatre of itself and went out. There was the agreeable sound of completed ritual. Glasses sang against one another in celebration. The orchestra found another air. For a few seconds, everyone spoke perhaps half a tone lower, as if the room had been made a chapel. "Now," said Lady Honoria, with the satisfaction of a woman whose evening was proceeding as it ought, "we shall be abolished." Alain, who had moved a little apart with Troy, felt the touch on his sleeve once more and half turned. A young woman, Deborah Montfort, the cousin, shy and eager, had looked as if she would speak, but she did not. Mr. Pym, behind her, adjusted a glass on a tray so that its lip did not tilt toward the floor. In the far doorway, Mr. Sarson's smile altered by an almost invisible degree and settled upon Imogen Lethbridge. There are certain hours in a well-run party when the very success of its arrangement opens a seam. Alain, who had attended a number of such occasions under various auspices, filed the moment away where he kept things that might matter. It was nothing, naturally, and it was not yet. But it had the quality of a hand lifted in a room, stilled, waiting for the right cue to make its gesture. There is a particular silence that falls after a trial of lights. It is not the lull of fatigue nor the hush of reverence. It is the hold of a breath while the theatre reconsiders itself as a room. The last electric brilliance sank obediently into the flies. A small amber bulb, the ghost's light, glowed with domestic modesty upon the royal Ophidian stage. Beyond, the house lay like a well-bred cave, seats folded into a velvet dusk that seemed to listen. Lady Collingwood, handsome in a dress that made a quiet point of its age, drew off her gloves and suggested, in a voice meant to be heard and not overheard, that the company repair to the green room. "For a morsel," she added, "we shall praise Mr. Verrall's waters and Miss Harcourt's maiden, and Fabian, of course." Her eyes made their habitual courteous sweep and did not find him. "Mrs. Bray?" "He was changing turbans, my lady," said Mrs. Bray, that thin and dutiful stage manager who ironed chaos into shape. "Act 3, he said he'd come for the toast." Sir Basil Montfort, with the magisterial languor of the critic who has lent his presence like a jewel and expects it to be set with discretion, allowed the corners of his mouth to regard themselves in irony. "Dear Fabian, he will contrive to enter late and steal his own commendation." Delia Harcourt, whose youthful calm was only accomplished with effort, had clapped lightly when the water scene died, as though she feared to bruise it, and now stood with both hands locked one within the other. "He won't be long," she said, to nobody in particular. "He can't bear to miss a curtain." Julian Verrill, who had painted the drowned reeds to flatter money and tempt despair, lit a cigarette and watched his match flatten and blacken. "Shall we go on, Lady Collingwood? The cress sandwiches will be turning into water weeds." "I think we'll bring him," said Lady Collingwood. "Mrs. Bray?" Mrs. Bray's nod, like her hands, was exact. She vanished into the wings with the contained trot of the truly efficient. The rest made a small pattern of waiting. Mr. Makepeace, the stage doorkeeper, having seen worse dramas at the door than the stage ever allowed, hovered between usefulness and disappearance. Miss Fitch, Lady Collingwood's secretary, consulted a little book and shut it again. The ghost light held its candle power and threw a narrow ring like a wedding ring fallen on the boards. "Don't bother," murmured Sir Basil to the air. "He will materialize as the last glass is poured, like a stage direction." Mrs. Bray did not return. There was an interval, precisely the length of a count of 30 if one counted slowly and with proper articulation. Then there was a shift in the air, a sort of absentedness, and Delia, for no reason she would later confidently name, turned her head towards the prompt side curtain. From between the folds of a heavy blue velvet drape, one of the side tormentors that guard the proscenium, there extended a hand. It was pale beneath its film of powder, and the neat veins at the wrist showed a delicate blue, like painted ornament. The fingers, finely made and characteristically restless in life, were still. A glove of slate-grey kid had been drawn only halfway on, as if the wearer had been interrupted by himself. Such was the stage's arrangement of light and dark that the hand seemed, for a second, to be etched upon the air rather than within it. Delia's breath made a sound. Not a cry, the sort of small intake one makes on entering a church by mistake. Sir Basil looked where she looked, and after a pause which in another man would have been shock, but in him was judgment, said in an altered voice, "Mrs. Bray." Mrs. Bray came from the shadow to the hand with a swiftness that was tidy rather than rapid. She lifted the curtain just enough, as though wary of admitting the audience. Behind it, Fabian Lee sat on a low rehearsal chair. His head had fallen back against the painted timber with a theatricality he would have despised. The other glove lay on his knee, palm upward, like a question that had been exhausted. The scarf from the Act 2 costume, a vague Eastern thing embroidered with mirrors, was looped loosely at his throat, but it was not tight. His mouth was parted a little, as if in courtesy. His eyes had settled into a look that actors teach themselves for death scenes and rarely bring into the world. Dr. Pargeter, who had been extracted to patronize the rehearsal because his wife had refused to come without him, stepped forward with the relief of a man given something sensible to do. He did not remove the scarf. He put 2 fingers at the angle of Fabian's jaw and then at his wrist. He looked at Lady Collingwood, and the movement of his head was very slight. "We shall not move him," Lady Collingwood said, rather to Mrs. Bray than to anyone else. "Makepeace, lock the stage door, quietly." Makepeace, whose life was a set of keys, disappeared as if he had been wound and released. "Delia," said Lady Collingwood, "you will sit down for a moment. Miss Fitch, my bag." She stood very straight and very still. The ghost's light made her pearls answer like a constellation. "Dr. Pargeter?" "I can do nothing," Dr. Pargeter said, with a careful dryness that made its own defenses. "There is no need for—" He did not say panic. "We must have the police." "Of course," said Lady Collingwood. She glanced at the hand, which had done such graceful labor, and then at Verrall, whose face had become a painter's blank. "We will be proper," she added, with a weight that had nothing to do with etiquette and everything to do with concealment. Sir Basil had gone a little grey at the temples, which he had always considered an asset and now resented. "It is intolerably apt," he murmured, because the habit of irony was a birthmark. "He dies in a theatre and in a pose. Forgive me." Mrs. Bray drew the curtain down again, covering the hand with the professionalism of a woman accustomed to keeping mechanisms out of sight. Delia heard the velvet whisper and found her voice arranged without her. "He was always cold," she said foolishly, staring at the grey glove. "He would not wear them in summer. He said it was affectation." She looked quickly at the scarf and then away. "Miss Harcourt," Lady Collingwood said, "you shall have tea." Enter Miss Fitch. The telephone. They stood very quietly while Miss Fitch went about the small practical work of catastrophe, writing a number as if it were a grocery. The theatre, broken into ordinary light in one circle of amber, remained obediently a room. Somewhere, a coil of rope dropped its tail with a soft complaint. It was, Sir Basil would say later, the most tasteful horror he had ever endured. And yet the taste of it lingered strangely, like perfume on leather. Rain had begun with a quiet obstinacy, and the Fenwick house received it with the same unreadable composure with which it received all London weather. Alain, shedding his overcoat in the tiled anteroom, found himself thinking that Troy would have liked the restraint of the place. A silver line of water, the black shine of laurel, the faint powdery smell of old plaster and varnish. A curated stillness. Fox, behind him, coughed with the discretion of a man who allowed bronchial disturbances only at properly appointed times. They were admitted by the butler, Pottle, whose face looked as if it had been ironed smooth and then folded by long habit into serviceable lines. "My lady is in the morning room, sir," he said, half to Allen and half to the integrity of the house. "The room in question has not been disturbed." They were taken first to the morning room. The small audience that remained had the exhausted elegance of a party that has discovered its own punctuation. Lady Honoria sat very upright beside the fireplace, hands folded precisely on the lap of a severe dark dress, as if insisting that decorum could be a kind of shield. Lionel Sedgwick, in 2 well-cut evening clothes that suggested a producer's nervousness with prosperity, stood by the mantelpiece and flicked invisible dust from the marble. Miss Evaden Hart reclined a little too deeply into a chair, the angle revealing a throat which she may have intended as an asset, but which now only showed the whiteness of distress. Sir Felix Mordaunt, whose opinions were a matter of national sport, had adopted a listening pose of rare virtue. Rosalind Gray stared at the carpet as if it might yield an answer, and Captain Davenant, by the door, looked soldierly and unhelpful. Alain said little. He let the room speak. He noted Lady Honoria's orchid, its throat already clouding, unrefreshed, an omission in a house where orchids are ritual. He saw the tray on a small table, 4 champagne flutes rinsed and set at an angle, a 5th left standing with a pale crescent of lipstick on the rim, coral rather than red, and a 6th, oddly, with no trace at all, only a faint sourness that, when understood, would not be spoken of in front of ladies. Pottle's eyes did not quite rest on it. "May we?" Alain asked gently. Pottle led them down the corridor, the muffled wornness of the carpet made eloquent by rain. He opened the octagon room with a key he had to ask his memory for, though Alain suspected his memory needed no help. A coolness lay in the room that was not only architectural. There were pictures hung with a respect that stopped short of reverence. Hands, mostly. A series of studies, a language of gesture. In one, a long-fingered hand caught a thread with a pin. In another, 2 blunt hands held a book by its spine. In a third, a woman's glove lay on the back of a chair with such precision of negligence that one could smell the powder. Troy would have approved and been infuriated. The body sat in a fauteuil near the north wall, half-turned as if to attend to an interruption beyond the door. Damien Croak had been a man whose bones had always shown faintly under the skin. Now they made their last appearance. One hand, the right, was relaxed on the chair's arm. The left lay near a small marble plinth where a modelled hand, no bigger than a child's, reached eternally out of stone. Croak's left fingers were smudged with charcoal. On the floor discreetly, a glove lay crumpled. Long, black kid, left hand only. The button at the wrist closed. Dr. Lambert, the house's tame physician, had attended and gone, leaving behind him a verdict that had sounded like an apology. "If it is apoplexy," Lady Honoria had said with dignity, "it is very inconsiderate." Apoplexy did not smell, however faintly, of almonds. Alan moved about the room as if it were a picture that needed different angles of light to give up its subject. He touched nothing. He observed the curtain cord at the tall window, plaited in an unusual way, not the ordinary loop one sees in townhouses, but a neat fisherman's bend, doubled. Fox, with his mild eyes, looked at it and looked away. He looked at the drinks table, a bottle in a bucket that had sweated itself into lassitude, a smaller, plain ice pail with 2 cubes left and water clouded by haste, a tiny silver funnel. The house glassware was engraved with a thistle. One flute standing by itself bore no lipstick, no sediment, and, as Pottle had not looked at it, Alan did. "May we have Sergeant Bailey attend to the tray, Fox?" he murmured. And to Pottle, "No further refreshments have been served in here since Mr. Croak, since the discovery." "No, sir," Pottle said. The "sir" sounded as if it had been polished but not forced. The pictures gave him, unexpectedly, a small pulse behind the eyes. One study, more labored than the others, clearly labeled E.H., showed a woman's hands in gloves, the left over the right, a ring of a particular flatness over the glove's stitching. Alan had seen Miss Hart's hands a moment ago. They were bare, the ring absent, her fingers innocent of powder. The sort of absence that makes itself present by effort. "What was the order of the little exhibition?" he asked lightly, as if they had all been good and nothing had happened. Pottle answered because Lady Honoria would prefer him to. "Guests assembled for champagne in the morning room, sir. Mr. Croak gave a few remarks here. We moved between the 2 rooms. There was a short interval for the musicians. Mr. Croak remained behind at the last. Miss Finch, her ladyship's secretary, was sent to fetch him. She found him as you see." A brush lay under the fauteuil. too fine for oil, too worn for vanity. It had picked up a flake of black paint that had fallen ungenerously from the modelled hand on the plinth. Alan looked along the baseboard and saw the faintest smear where a shoe had scuffed, turned, hesitated. He stood very still for a moment, and the rain obligingly made a soft sound to fill the room. He was not yet questioning. He was unlearning all the statements that would presently be made to him with conviction. When he spoke again, it was to ask for doors to be shut and windows kept as they were. He preferred this held breath. In the morning room, Lady Honoria would be composing what she would say to the newspapers, without intending to say anything at all. The actress would be choosing between a tear and a calm smile. The producer would recall where he had stood and change it in the retelling. The butler, who knew the house as a man knows his own pocket, would not tell him everything, not yet. Alain was content to let the house whisper to him first. It had begun. Alain asked for a small room and was given Lady Derringham's morning room, pale green walls, china dogs, and an admirable discretion of upholstery. Fox withdrew to the doorway with a notebook and the look of a benevolent lamp-post. The rain fretted the panes. Beyond, the house kept its hush, as if the curtains had learned to breathe. Lady Derringham came first. She was no longer young, and that was her strength. She had the courage of good manners. "I don't know what one says," she began, and made a sensible business of saying it. "It has been such a fearful accident. Or, well, I suppose I mustn't say that. You will say what it was." Poor Alistair. He was kind in the old way. He loved to tell Portia how to hold her glass. 19th century men always believe in glasses. "Portia," Elaine said. He had the trick of fitting a name into the room and letting it settle. "Portia Lascelles. She writes about pictures in that sprightly paper. She scolds art so prettily that the artists adore her." Alistair pretended to be shocked by that sort of girl, but he admired her, in fact. "I cannot think." She stopped herself. Had the General been unwell? "Never in public," said Lady Derringham with a dry precision. "He would rather have died than be unwell in public, and I suppose, oh, forgive me, he has." She added after a small silence, "He was wearied by Lucien's performance. Lucien Vale, the exhibition can be wearing. You noticed weariness?" "Noticed. One feels that sort of thing. He came to me about half an hour beforehand. He said it was a devil's circus and he'd have a breath somewhere quiet. He meant the little conservatory." She looked at her gloved hands. He preferred his own whiskey and the old brands. There was champagne, naturally. He sniffed at it. "Did he quarrel with anyone?" "I should so dislike the word quarrel, Inspector. There was a difference of taste. Lucien insists on effect. There is a great deal of hand in his pictures. Alistair said something about sentimentality. Lucien said something about courage. It was all done beautifully." She rose with a graceful compunction and gave him a list of names. She did not gossip so much as curate. Lucien Vale came next, exquisitely tired, with that irreproachable negligence which takes hours to contrive. He sank into the chair as if it were an arranged line. "My dear Inspector," he murmured, "if one must have a police, one is fortunate in a gentleman. Let me be childishly plain for once, and spare us both time. I did not poison the old war-horse. If he died of beauty, then I shall be hanged with laurel, but I suspect the coroner will be unimaginative. You were heard speaking with him. I speak with everyone. He said my hands at dusk were feminine. I said his medals were sentimental. We both found ourselves clever and shook hands. You see more hands. It is in the air. You left the gallery when?" "I left it several times. Artists leave their own exhibitions the way children run from birthday cakes. One grows sticky. I telephoned my framer. Mr. Quarles was telephoning his client. Portia said something kind and then something cruel. Lady Derringham, who is all decency, spread balm. Alistair went for his breath. Might one smoke? No. You are merciless. Alan thought that Vale's voice made curtsies. You knew the general well. Not well. Enough to sketch him when he was bored. He had very clean hands. I noticed that. Soldiers often do. They watched themselves. He would have liked to be painted as an idea, and that is so fatiguing, Inspector. One must paint what is, not the drumbeat of himself. He looked at Alan in the steady, charming manner of a man who has seen himself in 1,000 mirrors. Is there anything else, or shall I be good and sit where you can find me? Portia Lascelles, when she came, made a little play of flinging herself into seriousness. Without her hat, she was too young for the tricks she practiced, which gave her, oddly, a touch of candor. It's dreadful, she said. And of course it's my fault, because I told Sir Alistair to stop being a cavalry colonel about paintings. He laughed. He always laughed. It shook his tie. You were fond of him. I was fond of his affection for being shocked. It made him trust me, which is always touching. Inspector, I didn't see him drink anything. He was on one of his speeches about how champagne was for people who don't drink wine. The butler, what's his elegiac name? Fallow? Fallow hovered with a decanter. Sir Alistair said something about no muck, and Fallow melted into something brown and true. It's an art. Her eyes slid sideways. Mr. Quarles is made of nerves. He's been trying to sell Lucian to the nation, and Sir Alistair had views, donations. It's all rather dreary and money. Did Sir Alistair intend to withdraw support? He intended to be important. You can't blame him. I intend it myself when I am 40. Nigel Quarles arrived damp at the temples and full of phrases. Unspeakable calamity, he said, and pressed his lips. He was a tidy, anxious creature with expensive shoes that squeaked. Sir Alistair was a pillar, literally a pillar of the trustees. You must apprehend, Inspector. I had to telephone a collector in Brussels. Timing is happiness in our world. As to the late, oh Lord, the late general, he could be difficult. A patron is a weather. If he had trouble with his heart, he never told me. I'm sure he had no trouble with his heart. He had perhaps trouble with, perception. He could be blunt. You had words with him? One always has words. He disliked a catalogue note I had drafted about the human hand as emblem and witness. He said in his way that hands were for doing and pictures were for hanging. You see how, anyway. I'm at your disposal. When they were gone, the room returned to its small breathing. Fox shut the door with a respectful finger. What do you make of them, sir? Arrangements, said Elaine, each very careful with himself. He stood a moment, hearing the faint orchestration of a house after shock. The tinkle of glass, a soft footfall, a door treated as if it were frangible. Fallow, the butler, passed the half-open doorway at that moment with a tray and an impassive face. He did not look in, and that, too, was a kind of looking. Elaine observed the old-fashioned decanter, its stopper laid beside it, and the careful white of the napkin over the silver. Ask Mr. Fallow if he will spare me 5 minutes, Elaine said. Not just yet, when it suits him. He smiled, and Fox, who had seen that smile employed with ministers and stage managers, went off down the polished passage. The house, having flinched, composed itself again. In the service passage, the tick of a bracket clock resumed its unassuming sovereignty, and an undermaid, with cheeks chalked by tears, moved a stack of plates with a kind of penitential care. Elaine, pausing there, found that the air had taken on the discreet odor of silver polish and damp linen, as if the domestic system, affronted by calamity, had determined to drown it with ritual. Basil Ede, afflicted with that curious grandeur acquired by the perfect butler, stood in the pantry as if the polished mahogany and the array of glasses owed allegiance to him personally. He inclined his head, not much more than a quiver of deference. Inspector, I wonder, said Elaine, if you would be so very good as to tell me about the service during the interval. I'm anxious not to intrude upon the household's order more than is necessary." "Thank you, sir. It is understood that you will do as you judge proper." Basil's tone suggested that decency, and he had formed an alliance against disaster. During the interval, champagne and cups were offered in the anteroom. Lady Hermione's instructions were that some of the company might prefer lemonade. Mr. Dane always took orgeat. "Always?" "It was a habit," said Basil, and the pause between the article and the noun was as thin and revealing as the edge of a leaf. Mr. Dane's digestion was uncertain. He would not take wine. "And last night?" "I sent Jarvis with the tray, sir. Mr. Dane was in the blue room." Basil's eyes moved to the small slate upon which a housemaid had scrawled, "Blue Ram 2 champers, 1 lem, 1 org." The final word was smudged. One felt, absurdly, that Basil had tried to rub out the almond and failed. "Jarvis?" Alain repeated. "A footman, sir. We do not bring the junior staff into the public rooms ordinarily, but the stage created exigencies." Alain let the silence breathe. Basil filled it, as he was intended to do. "The bells went, you see. There was a difficulty with the lights. We took down the main switch for the effect, and when Mr. Latham called for black, the house was unprepared for the corridor being so dark. Jarvis knows the passage as well as any. He carried a candle." "In a glass?" Alain asked. "In the silver sconce," Basil corrected him gently. "He is not a clumsy boy, Inspector." "Yet you hesitated," said Alain, looking at the polished dome of an entree dish as if it might be the landscape upon which this conversation was happening. Basil's lips made the smallest confession. "We are shaken, sir. One is not used to the presence of death in a house like this." "Quite." Alain's gaze rested for a moment upon a small basin of warm water at the end of the dresser. A single tumbler sat to one side on a folded cloth. The bowl was clouded, not from dirt, but from something that had dissolved reluctantly. There was a light medicinal tang, almost an afterthought in the air. "Mrs. Thrip," Alain said, as the housekeeper's shadow formed in the doorway. She came in as if she had been waiting for absolution. "Sir Julian thought it best we should fetch our breath where we could," she announced to Alain's reflection in the glass. She wore the armor of an upright woman who had known difficulty and driven it from the house with a broom. "I've told my girls they are not to chatter." "Thank you," said Alain. "Will you tell me only this? Did any of the company come through the service passage during the rehearsal?" Her gaze flickered to Basil, and away again. "We had Miss Crisp's dresser, sir. The young woman as assists her at the theatre. She's not ours." "A girl with a little black case," Basil said, more quickly than Mrs. Thrip would have liked. "Violet," the housekeeper conceded. "She and Jarvis are cousins. She would not presume, sir. Only Miss Crisp is accustomed to proper arrangements, and the ladies' dressing room at the foot of the stairs has a draught." "Of course." Alain's tone was bland enough to encourage. "Did Violet bring anything into the pantry?" Mrs. Thrip's glance was very straight and very full. "No, sir. She waited in the scullery till Miss Crisp called. She had gloves," she added, and the word fell like a button from a tightened seam. "Long evening ones. Miss Crisp is particular." "White." "Pale," said Basil, and then, with the faintest stir, "pearl." Alain shifted his attention to the slate, the smudge of org, the bowl, the orphan glass. "Jarvis," he said, "may I speak to him?" Jarvis presented himself with a mixture of frightened devotion and an attempt at masculine composure. He was pink about the ears and had a tiny cut across the knuckle of one hand. A strip of linen, improvised and absurdly neat, explained it. "That was not from last night?" Alain asked mildly. "From the sconce, sir. The edge is sharper than it looks. I set it down for a moment when there was a darkness. You carried Mr. Dane's orgeat to the blue room. You did not set it down until you were in the room." "No, sir. Only Violet was there, sir. She was in the passage with her case. She asked the way to the small stairs." "And you?" I told her. I went on. Mr. Dane said, "My usual, sir," and smiled. I did not see him again. "That will do," said Basil gently, before Alain could speak. It was not an impertinence, it was a defense. The household closed ranks by habit, not malice. Alain recognized it and did not resent it. He stood for a moment, letting the membrane of propriety settle over the scene. There was a tremor under it, like a plucked string still sounding in the wood of an instrument. He thought of the hand with the neatly bound cut, the girl with the case and the gloves, the smudged chalk of Org, on the slate, and of Basil, whose apology for the presence of death was not an apology at all, but a statement of jurisdiction. "If I may," he said to Mrs. Thrip, as if asking for sugar, "I should like to see the small stairs. And later, Violet." Mrs. Thrip bowed without moving her head. "If you will come this way, sir," she said, and the house, patient and proud, led him by its arteries toward the quiet dark, where nobody goes who does not know the way. By the time the house had forgotten how to whisper and merely held its breath, the inspector returned to the long gallery. The paintings, swaddled in satin light, made their own conversation of glances. Ancestral eyes, shutters of guilt, the hush of distilled self-regard. He stood with the butler in the doorway, where the overnight draft had lifted one corner of the dust sheet covering the dais. A faint print, no more than an oily coronet, marked the satin and meant nothing yet. "Let us walk it," the inspector said, "as you would of an evening." Mr. Leggett, being at once offended by the notion that he might ever forget his duties and comforted by the invitation to display them, bowed and proceeded. He moved first to the sideboard as though answering a summons. From a cupboard he would ordinarily produce the polished tray and arrange, left to right, the decanters: port, sherry, brandy. Port with the stag stopper, sherry with the fox, brandy with the boar. He recited the order quietly, and his hands hovered over the cut glass as a man's might over the piano keys before a familiar piece. "Last night," the inspector said, "were they so placed?" The butler's lips compressed. "I found the fox in the center and the boar at the sherry's throat. There had been handling. By whom? I cannot say. The doors were open to the company till 10. After that, I'm at the door. I looked in again shortly after 11. You would have corrected them." "Certainly, sir." A blush of professional shame touched his bony cheeks. "If I had observed it then, after—" He paused. "After Mr. Marden was found," the inspector supplied, lending the necessary noun without lending any horror to it. "Yes, then I observed it." They crossed to the French windows that gave upon the terrace, and Leggett described his habit with the locks. The key turned twice, the bolt lifted, the handle tested. He demonstrated on the interior doors too, and the unlovely detail of the scullery door with its paint worn smooth by generations of keys. The inspector noted where Leggett's fingertips never touched and where they must. The upper brass was clean. The lower showed a crescent of dullness where a hand had fumbled, not a servant's capable one, but a hand impatient with unfamiliar knobs. There were faint traces of grease, as if from cosmetics. "What of the curtain?" the inspector asked, with an eye for a domestic's pride. Leggett followed his gaze to the velvet hanging that had concealed the dais during the unveiling. "It is always tied off on the left," he said, "with the cords knotted twice, ends even." "Last night?" "Knotted but uneven," Leggett said slowly. "The right end shortened. I remember because Miss Renford—" He stopped, reassessed, and retreated. "Because it is not how I leave it." The inspector let it go, but filed the name, now unrevealed and therefore more present. He bent by the dais and touched the small, oilish print on the dust sheet. It smudged under his finger and left the faintest scent of grease paint. Not scent at all, only the idea of scent, which is more insistent. On the carved newel of the back stair, the staircase used by the musicians during the masque, and by servants with trays, the polished hand of mahogany caught his eye. It had been fashioned as a jest by some 18th century irreverent, a wooden hand, palm up, at the turn. A darker patch lay across the palm, and the gleam about it was dulled. "You're Polish, Legate," he said. "Applied each Thursday, sir." "Then it has been recently touched." The butler performed a discreet inspection and said nothing. It is possible to bow to a fact without admitting it. They moved to the small anteroom where programs for the masque had been stacked on a chair. There were fewer than the inspector remembered. He had an irritatingly precise memory for trivial numbers, a habit over which he had no mastery. "How many were printed?" 20, sir. That is, Mrs. Clay counted them when they arrived. A needless pamphlet, if I may say so." "The waste of ink is a grievance shared by many," the inspector murmured. "I make 17 now." Legate's face acquired that expression particular to professionals faced with numeracy, a modest horror. They must have been taken as mementos. By whom? Again that small pause that meant the butler was choosing between unwanted versions of the truth. "Guests, sir." The inspector let the room exhale. On the small escritoire lay a pair of white gloves, folded. They were not new. The right thumb showed a smear where a woman's white doeskin had met a jar of something inadvisable. It had been wiped, imperfectly. He did not touch them. He passed instead to the pianoforte at the far end, where the score lay open not at the final page, as it had at the rehearsal, but at the opening bars. Someone had reopened it in idle habit or careful deceit. He could not yet say. "I should like to see the mail tray," he said. Legate conducted him to the hall table with the day's correspondence, so neatly staged one could admire it as a still life. Ivory cards, a hand with a thick, old-fashioned slant, a telegraph envelope like a small accusation. The butler lifted it with the careful disdain of a man who preferred letters that had been composed in ink. "For Miss Renford," he said. The inspector noted the time-stamp and the place of origin, which gave him nothing and asked to be read at once. He did not open it. That was not his habit. He looked instead at the tray itself. 4 places for letters, 1 for circulars, 1 for invitations. A ritual, a pattern. And in the corner, a pressed carnation, browning at the edges, tucked beneath the leather blotter as though hidden against a sudden need. Someone's keepsake, someone's fear. The house took back its breath and held it again. The inspector, in that suspended air, found the shape of a likelihood, no more than the lightest drift among his thoughts, and let it settle without moving to touch it. He asked for tea to be brought to the small morning room and, as Legate withdrew, heard in the passage the rustle of a dress and the faint click of a latch closing softly where there should have been no door at all. The October evening had settled over Belgrave Square with that particular London quality of muffled elegance, where even the fog seemed to possess good breeding. Lady Constance Harwick's drawing-room glowed with subdued amber light, the sort that flattered aging complexions and cast forgiving shadows over the small tensions that inevitably arose when artistic temperament collided with social propriety. The occasion was ostensibly a celebration, the opening of Vivian Ashworth's exhibition at the Meridian Gallery, but the atmosphere carried an undercurrent of something less festive. Perhaps it was the way Mrs. Felicity Drummond held her champagne glass, fingers white-knuckled around the crystal stem, or how Sir Nigel Ashworth avoided meeting his brother's eyes across the Persian carpet. Even the servants moved with a heightened awareness, as if sensing electricity in the air before a storm. "Darling Vivian, such extraordinary work," Lady Harwick was saying, her voice carrying that particular cadence of the well-bred woman who has learned to make compliments sound like benedictions. "Though I must confess, some of the pieces are rather intense." Vivian Ashworth, tall and angular with prematurely silver hair that caught the lamplight, accepted the observation with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Art should disturb the comfortable, shouldn't it? Otherwise, what's the point?" "How perfectly bohemian of you." interjected Mrs. Drummond, and there was something sharp beneath her silk-smooth tone. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 45, with the kind of carefully maintained beauty that suggested both discipline and desperation. Though I suppose comfort is relative. Some of us find different things disturbing. The comment hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigarette, and Inspector Roderick Allen, who had been observing from his position near the marble fireplace, noted how the remark caused Sir Nigel to shift uncomfortably in his leather chair. The brothers bore a strong resemblance. The same aquiline nose, the same intelligent grey eyes. But where Vivian possessed the restless energy of the artist, Nigel carried himself with the measured dignity of a man accustomed to boardrooms and parliamentary committees. Felicity, really? Sir Nigel murmured, but his protest lacked conviction. Young Timothy Ashworth, Nigel's son and barely 22, looked up from where he'd been studying one of his uncle's canvases with the intensity of youth, trying to appear sophisticated. "I think Uncle Vivian's work is brilliant," he said, with the defiant loyalty of the young. "It's honest, at least." "Honesty," repeated Mrs. Drummond, as if tasting something unpleasant. Such a dangerous virtue. Alain found himself studying the dynamics with the detached interest of a naturalist observing a complex ecosystem. He had come this evening as Lady Harwick's guest, drawn by genuine appreciation for Ashworth's work and the promise of intelligent conversation. But there was something else at play here, currents of tension that ran deeper than artistic criticism or family rivalry. The butler, Stevens, appeared at Lady Harwick's elbow with the practiced invisibility of the truly competent servant. "Shall I serve dinner now, my lady?" "Yes, I think so." Lady Harwick rose with fluid grace, her sapphire silk rustling softly. "Vivian, you must sit beside me. I want to hear all about your time in Florence." As the small party moved toward the dining room, Alain noticed how Mrs. Drummond's gaze lingered on Vivian Ashworth's profile and how Sir Nigel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Young Timothy walked beside his uncle, chattering about technique and inspiration, while the artist nodded absently, his attention seemingly elsewhere. The dining room was a study in understated luxury, all mahogany and crystal and the soft gleam of Georgian silver. As they took their places around the polished table, Alain found himself seated between Lady Harwick and young Timothy, perfectly positioned to observe the interplay of personalities that was already beginning to unfold like a carefully choreographed dance of manners and hidden meanings. The first course was served in near silence, broken only by the gentle clink of silver against porcelain and Lady Harwick's gentle inquiries about mutual acquaintances. But beneath the surface civility, something darker was stirring, and Alain had the distinct impression that the evening's true drama had yet to begin. The soup course passed with the ritualistic precision of a well-rehearsed performance, each participant playing their designated role in the theatre of polite society. Yet Alain found himself increasingly aware of the subtle discordances. The way Mrs. Drummond's laugh came a fraction too late at Lady Harwick's gentle wit. How Sir Nigel's responses to his brother's anecdotes carried an undercurrent of something that might have been resentment, or perhaps something more complex. The Florentine light was extraordinary this summer, Vivian was saying, his long fingers gesturing as he spoke. It has a quality that transforms everything it touches. I found myself painting subjects I'd never considered before. His eyes, when they met Mrs. Drummond's across the table, held a significance that seemed lost on no one except, perhaps, young Timothy. "How fascinating," Lady Harwick murmured. "And did you work entirely alone, or did you have assistants?" The question, innocuous enough on its surface, caused a momentary stillness to descend upon the table. Mrs. Drummond's fork paused halfway to her lips, and Sir Nigel's knuckles whitened as he gripped his wine-glass. "One always works alone, ultimately," Vivian replied, but there was something evasive in his tone. "Though inspiration can come from unexpected sources. Young Timothy, with the obliviousness of youth, plunged into the silence. "Uncle Vivian, you must show Inspector Allen the portrait." Allen had the trick, learned half by habit and half by temperament, of letting a room settle about him until, as heavy dust does in stopped air, the temper of it lay visible. Greystones, with its elliptic gallery and its lamps shaded in green silk, had resumed its polished self-control. The servants went soft-footed along passages. A footman polished with unnecessary industry a balustrade that needed no attention. Somewhere a clock made, with an air of discretion, a note on the hour. The house had taken back its silence as a careful woman replaces a jewel in a case. Fox had gone down to the village to consult the night constable and the doctor. Lady Honoria had withdrawn, ostentatiously composed, leaving her niece to a tray and the intervention of hot milk. Mr. Lionel Ashe, with the air of a man whose palate was soured by having been right too soon, had retired to his room, not before casting on Alain one of his faintly theatrical looks of experienced melancholy. Mr. Alistair Wynne, who wore success as if it might at any moment be exchanged for something more flattering, had asked whether he might telephone an agent. He had been told, with what the footman Thomas believed to be a kind of good breeding peculiar to policemen, that he might not. Alain went back to the gallery. The painting that had given the evening its title, a small canvas hung with an immodesty that seemed intentional, was all shadow and a pallor like a hand's back, emerging to find a switch that was not there. It had the indecency of privacy observed. Julian Black, so slight a name, so tidy a signature on the lower right, and now attached to a body that lay without the ardor of a worn-out man, had made it as a jest, someone had said. The jest had thickened. He went along the line of chairs drawn neatly under the walls. On one seat, a lap rug had been folded. Mrs. Penhaligon's, he remembered, the automatic chill of a woman perpetually protected against draughts. The rug smelt faintly of orris. He noted it because the fold was not her maid's precise work. Thomas had done it hastily, while the shock of the thing was new. He had missed the corner. It made no difference unless one was disposed to think of missed corners. At the door to the lighting cupboard, the screw in the lower hinge shone. Someone had turned it later than the others. He would not say so yet, not even to Fox, because it was as much rumor as deduction. Mrs. Ferris would have known. Mrs. Ferris had found it pointedly uninteresting. The butler, Pym, had said nothing at all and had contrived to do so with the clarity of a pronouncement. Their silence was not secrecy, he thought, but allegiance. It was a thing the very grand had once purchased along with silver and portraits. In the small sitting room off the gallery, with its stern plot of Persian carpet and its arrangement of books chosen for titles rather than content, the tray with a sherry decanter and 2 glasses had been set back on its table. There was a dry ring in the dust where the decanter had not been. He had seen, in another house, another evening, the same innocent arithmetic of absence. He lifted the stopper and smelt it. Sherry has always the suggestion of a civilized tear. This was a little sweeter than it might have been. He replaced the stopper delicately, as if someone might be asleep nearby. The letter, too, lay in its composed place on the writing table, the note which had sent Dr. Hart to the orangery at the exact moment when his presence had been needed elsewhere, and given the crisis the comfortable margin in which to ripen. The paper was Greystone's cream with the black edge. The hand, a decisive imitation of Lady Honoria's, was only betrayed in the L of her name. The loop reached too eagerly for elegance and fell short. Miss Claire Bede wrote a hand with small careful connections. Rosalind Lethbridge a schoolroom neatness. Mrs. Penhaligon an ungenerous script. Mr. Ashe, he suspected, would print. And there was Wynne, who flattered the air as he flattered people. Method was never so much ink as attitude. He did not yet know whose attitude he had read in that loop. He walked past the long case clock that Pym wound at 10. Tonight it had been wound before the guests arrived. Pym had not needed to tell him. The slight misalignment of the key on its hook said as much, and Pym's smooth shoulder, turning fractionally, had confirmed it. A household is a pattern. Someone had dropped a stitch. Fox came in, stamping the damp from his shoes with an apology to the carpet that was entirely his own. "Dr. Hart's account tallies," he said. "Time as near as makes no matter. No signs of a turn before it. No dramatic symptoms. He's very much of the view that if it was done very quietly." "Dr. Hart is an exact man," Alain said. "He collects Victorian penknives. Did you know? The sort with ridiculous attachments." He turned back to the small canvas. "We shall not trouble him with our penknives." "Sherry?" Fox asked. He had been with him too long not to inquire without emphasis. "It is very slightly sweeter than it should be," Alain said. "Only a trifle. Like a compliment from Mr. Wynne." Fox grunted. "The forged note?" "It is a flattering hand," said Alain. "One writes flattery with one's whole person. You will find, too, that Mrs. Ferris will be of no assistance, and that Pym will be of the sort of help that is not unhelpful. We will not press them. People who have spent their lives guarding other people's lives resent impertinence and tell lies when pressed. Let them keep their honor." They were silent. In the gallery, the painted hand reached towards its absent switch, and the light lay where it had been told to lie by someone nobody had seen. Alan felt in himself the small subsidence that follows the first astonishment of violence, the drawer that shuts, the paperweight set back in its place, the ordered mind laying out its specimens. One motive came forward and was dismissed as vulgar. Another, perfectly reasonable, was too tidy. A third, slack with pity, attached itself to the wrong person. He recognized in himself the obstinacy that, at its best, becomes discernment. "We'll go to bed," he said, and Fox raised an eyebrow at the extravagance of the plan. "In the morning I should like to watch the house wake. Rituals are more honest before breakfast." He paused, as if listening to something long decided. "And we'll ask Miss Bede whether she ever begins an L without thinking of the flourish at the end." Alain asked for the green library. The room kept its cool even when the house warmed itself for callers. The scent of polished leather and the small simmer of a coal fire lent it a civilized air. A decanter stood between two glasses, as if the house, in its correct way, had anticipated what might be required, and the single lamp made an island of light upon the bays. Mr. Ashe came in as one who knows a room's habits. He closed the door with precise fingers, and waited, rather as a man waits upon a stage direction he does not approve. He was neat to the point of pallor. His collar looked as if it had never suffered a false move. The smoothness didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do sit down," said Alain. "I'm afraid I must trespass on your kindness for a little longer." The secretary inclined his head and sat on the edge of his chair. "Of course, Inspector. Lady Greyswood has told me to place myself unreservedly at your disposal." "Very good of her. Have you any objection to a drop of something?" "I don't, thank you." Alain poured himself a finger and did not drink. He took the letter from his pocketbook and laid it upon the green. In the lamplight it looked disarmingly innocent, with its measured lines and thin, beautiful hand. One could imagine it slipping, all crispness and scent, into a letter case, and there leaving its effect like the breath of a flower. "You found this in Mr. Darnell's overcoat," said Alain. "I did." "And you read it?" There was the faintest pause. "I thought it right to acquaint myself with its contents." "In the circumstances?" "Quite. And then you brought it to me?" "Yes." Alain touched the signature with a finger. "A pretty hand. You keep Lady Greyswood's correspondence, I think?" "I do. It is part of my function." "Of course." He let the silence sit. It was an amiable little creature. Silence, when allowed to make itself at home. After a moment he said, "You have excellent ink in your room. Jackson's blue-black." Ashe's lids lowered. "We have." The same ink stands in the small tray on the writing table in the west passage. It is your practice to replenish it every morning. I suppose so. Yes. And the Remington in your office has a capricious E. This time the pause was decisive. The eyes, when they lifted, were arid. I see. You are a conscientious man, said Alain gently. I imagine it was not a very easy thing to do. You will have kept blotters. You will have been careful with the margins. You will have meant, above all, to take the heat from a lady's name. Mr. Ash's throat moved. Inspector, if this is to be an accusation— No, said Alain, not of murder. The secretary's hands, which had been perfectly joined, unclasped and joined again. I did not kill Mr. Darnell. I know. Alain leaned back. In your place, seeing what you saw, I might have contrived a letter. You wished us to suppose that Mr. Darnell came to terms, that there was no quarrel, that a certain danger was past. You wished us to look elsewhere for a reason. Perhaps you wished to give comfort. Ash's mouth trembled and steadied. Lady Greyswood is not to be dragged in, he said, and the modest voice had in it, for once, an ungovernable edge. You cannot know how nearly— He stopped, took in the room and lowered his tone. I beg your pardon. You are devoted to her. I am in her debt. Professionally, in every possible sense. He swallowed. If you must have it, I wrote the letter. I am hopelessly at fault, but I did not touch Mr. Darnell. I saw him not at all after the guests returned to the saloon. I went to the west passage to the table there and wrote. That is all. You did not go into the little gallery? No. Nor to the lamp? The bronze hand? The smallest flicker? No. Alain looked at him and then away, at the lamp's circle of light. It is an admirable thing, he said, how houses evolve their ceremonies. At Greyswood there is the bronze hand to be turned at the end of a private view, the French clock in the south corridor, which our friend Marsh winds at 11. The decanters come in from the pantry at 1:45. A pattern, pleasant, inevitable. One can see how, in such a setting, the slightest dislocation is almost indecorous. Ash stared at the baize. I take your point. You will also see why a glove upon that hand last night is more than a theatrical touch. I did not place it there. No, said Alain again. You would not do a theatrical thing. A color came and went in the secretary's face. Miss Warren, he said, and then, I did not say that. You did not. You have said enough. Alain rose and, with his usual precision, replaced the letter in his pocket. You have helped me more than you know by telling me what you did and what you did not. You understand that I may be obliged to use it. I suppose I do. I will ask you for one further service. Will you be good enough to ask Lady Greyswood to consent to a small gathering this evening? Not the whole party, those who are concerned with the picture room and the passages. We will keep it all very quiet. Mr. Ash stood. He had recovered his composed surface. I will tell her. Thank you. Alain added gently, You have behaved foolishly and well. It happens. When the secretary had gone, he stood where he was, for some minutes. The old house breathed faintly around him. Somewhere far off a bell marked the hour, and under it the muffled complaint of the French clock protested before it consented to be right. He thought of a hand, gloved and deliberate, turning metal in the dark. Of a face that paused, listening, accustomed to ceremonial sounds. Of a person who could not bear the indecorum of chance, and so arranged it. Then he put down his untouched glass and sent a message to the pantry. It was time, he thought, to set the scene. There would be no theatricals, only a few people, a lamp, and a clock that everyone could hear. They were in the small library that gave on to the yew walk, where the scent of box pressed faintly against the panes, and the fire had settled into a discreet glow. Lady Constance sat very straight, her hands folded upon the head of her stick, as if propriety might still the tremor in them. Adrian Blackwood stood by the bureau, not touching it, and looking, Alain thought, like one of those portraits in which the painter, rather than the sitter, had allowed something unguarded to show through the polish. "I don't propose," said Alain, "to rehearse the whole of it. It would only distress Lady Constance, and it would be quite unnecessary for you." Lady Constance inclined her head. "I should prefer you to speak plainly, Inspector," she said. "We have dressed the evening with so much tact that there is, I think, none left to spend." "Very well," said Alain. "Sir Reginald died of digitalis poisoning. Dr. Pettigrew's analysis is conclusive. The fatal dose was taken between the end of dinner and the moment Mrs. Harley began the nocturne. It was not in the coffee, it was in the sugared lozenge Sir Reginald always allowed himself before music, as a concession to his cough." Adrian's eyes did not move, but something in his stillness altered. Lady Constance's fingers tightened upon the silver ferrule of her stick. "The lozenges," she murmured. "In the lacquer box." "In the lacquer box," Alain agreed. "You keep it on the pianoforte. Miles places it there each evening. He told me so, very reluctantly, because he had no wish to seem indiscreet. He also told me that Sir Reginald never helped himself unless you offered it. He was particular in these small civilities. Last night, however, during that little flurry when the lamps went down, very momentarily, and you sent for fresh candles, someone put the box into Sir Reginald's hand and said, if I may quote Miles, 'Here, old man, this will settle it?'" Lady Constance looked from one to the other. "I was not in the room," she said. "I had gone to speak to Cook." "You had," said Alain. "And yet the ritual was observed, or mimicked. That interested me. Rituals, you see, are habits of mind before they are habits of action." Sir Reginald took the lozenge without thinking, as he always did when you offered it. He could not. "See!" He took it from another hand. Adrian lifted his head. "You are very careful, Inspector," he said quietly. "You should be very certain." "I am as certain," said Alain, "as one is of the quality of a brushstroke one has looked at for a long time. The digitalis tablets were taken 2 days ago from Dr. Pettigrew's case when he came to see Lady Constance about her neuralgia. He is ashamed of his carelessness and told me so at once. Miles saw you come from the morning room where the case was left. He said nothing. It is not in his nature to embroil the family." Later, the packet of lozenges was resealed with gum that leaves a faint, rather characteristic smell. The same smell clings to your palette knife in the studio and to that jade figurine on the terrace table which, according to Sir Reginald, could not have been anything but a forgery. Adrian's mouth crooked. "Jade," he said, "of all things." "You made a tolerable living abroad," Alain went on, "by improving antiquities that were not. Sir Reginald knew your workmanship. He told me as much before dinner when we walked in the gallery. He intended to speak of it to Lady Constance, not unkindly, but plainly. You would be ruined. More to the point, she would be dragged through that particular mud, and you could not allow it. You chose a method that would seem like a small failure of the heart in an old man who had been dining." There was, in the silence that followed, the slight sound of the fire readjusting itself. Lady Constance spoke, and only then did her voice break. "Adrian," he turned to her, and Alain, who disliked such moments, looked instead at the spines of the books whose titles had been rubbed thin by successive hands. "Aunt Con," Adrian said very gently, "he would have ruined us. He meant no harm by it, but he would have." He looked back at Alain. "You say chose, Inspector. It was less choice than a narrowing corridor. The darkness was not my doing, but I took it when it came." He put out his hand, and you placed the box in it," said Alain, the hand in the darkness. "Yes." Adrian breathed out, and the small, unshaped sound that escaped him might have been laughter or grief. He said, "Thank you, my dear." He thought I was her. Lady Constance closed her eyes. "No," she said, as if to some inner witness. "No." "There is no need," said Alain, almost brusquely. for anything more theatrical than the fact. I shall have to ask you to come with me, Mr. Blackwood. There will be formalities. Dr. Pettigrew will meet us. Miles will arrange for your bag." Adrian nodded. "I wondered what you would make of the figurine," he said. "It was too neat. One always makes something too neat. May I?" He gestured toward Lady Constance. Alain stepped back. They did not touch. She had already drawn her hands together, and as he bowed to her, she inclined her head as if he were going away on a small, tiresome journey from which he would surely return. When the door closed, she said, in a voice that seemed to recognize its own futility, "He was always a courteous boy." Alain looked into the fire where the ash remembered the shape of the last log. "Yes," he said, "and courteous boys, like courteous men, sometimes find very quiet ways of doing very desperate things." He stood for a moment longer, listening to the soft domestic noises of the house, collecting itself about the absence it had been given, and then went out into the passage where Miles waited, patient, unspeaking, and the yew walk lay like a black bar across the window. Silence settled upon the drawing-room as naturally as dusk, and held. The fire had ebbed to a low red, and the terracotta hand upon the mantel, that votive fragment with its fine Etruscan fingers, seemed to offer, absurdly, an unasked benediction. No one looked at it. They were all in their separate ways, looking inward. Sir Reginald stood very straight, his profile cut cleanly against the pale paneling. He had accepted Alain's quiet statement and, after the minute in which words exist and are absorbed, had nodded as a man might to a cartographer when shown an unfamiliar spit of land already entered on the map. He did not argue. He did not confess. He asked, in an old voice that had been used to lecterns and well-ordered audiences, if there were, perhaps, time to write a note. Alain said that there was, and added, almost diffidently, "Mr. Fox will remain with you. You understand." Sir Reginald inclined his head. "Quite." The word had edges. Fox, large, inconspicuous, steadfast, stepped aside as the baronet crossed to the writing table. The room watched him. Lady Constance, with a composure so exact it was like a faultless seam. Diana, with a hand pressed to her throat, not theatrically, but as if she found the bones of it curious and necessary to reassure. Dr. Pettigrew, with the immobility of a man who, in professional moments, simply sets aside himself. Colonel Forrester sat down very carefully, as if a wound might reopen if jarred. The pen scratched once, lifted, made its small dry music again. The old rituals held. The tray from Jarvis, the butler, arrived with tea for no one in particular, paused halfway to a table when Jarvis observed the futility of custom, and hovered with that peculiar discretion which is, in some servants, a species of authority. Alain, who noticed these minor obediences as one notices wind shifts at sea, let them happen. He stood a little apart from the others and tried not to feel the pull of pity. It was not, in any case, for him to indulge. He had, he supposed, done what was required of him, followed in that quiet corridor behind the bright frontage of things, the misplaced figurine, the amended letter, the glove which had been put away by the wrong hand, and that small failure of habit which had loosed the whole mechanism. He had seen the mind at work, the choice made not in a heat, but under pressure, deliberately, as a man sets a fragile thing just so, and is in the instant trapped by his own delicacy. Sir Reginald sealed the envelope. He regarded it as one might a lantern before the night walk, and gave it to Fox. "For my sister," he said. "There is nothing theatrical in it, Inspector. You have spared me that." "Thank you," said Alain. Lady Constance rose. She came to Sir Reginald and extended her hand. It was an old fashion and, in the circumstances, a courage. "I am sorry," she said. The words were sufficient. They understood each other. There was history there, and dinners, and the way one had once relied on another's cleverness to make an evening go. Sir Reginald kissed the air near her fingers, not touching. To have been found out by an amateur of society, he said with a flicker of the ancient charm, is perhaps the most fitting end. I am afraid, Alain remarked, I am nothing of the kind. On the contrary, said Sir Reginald, you are precisely the kind. Only your society is of another order. Diana's voice came thinly. I never believed. She stopped. She had believed, almost all of them had, once the quiet weight of Alain's reasoning had dropped upon their arrangements of loyalty and dislike, like a book placed on a fluttering paper. Pettigrew moved at last to the fire and bent to it, as if the practical were his refuge. If you will allow me, he said to no one in particular, and with the poker he settled the logs so that one small flame found air. It made a sound like a child sighing. Will there be handcuffs? Colonel Forrester asked Alain with a careful bluffness that might have been for the room's sake. No, Alain said. Not here. Sir Reginald smiled. He picked up his hat, which Jarvis had set ready on a chair, as if this, too, had been always his duty and needed only a different object to fulfill it. A small mercy, he said, the last word intact. He paused at the mantel and looked briefly at the terracotta hand. There was, in the glance, a scholar's melancholy. I meant to write a paper about it, he told Alain. The votive offerings of those who held themselves blameless and laid down hands in the dark in case there was judgment. You will forgive me, Alain said, if I think that judgment is increasingly a matter for daylight. They went out together, Fox following. The door closed without sound. The room, released, did not speak. Lady Constance sat again. Diana began, in that jerky way of the overwrought, to set straight a little wrecked island of coasters and matches. Pettigrew, who had light enough now, let the flame go about its business and stood back, his face emptied of its disciplines. Jarvis, Lady Constance said after a time, we shall have breakfast rather later tomorrow. It was a bare, ridiculous sentence, and sensible. Jarvis bowed and went away to rearrange the future into something the house could tolerate. Alain came back after speaking with the driver and the constable on the steps. He did not sit. There will be statements, he said. In the morning, you have all been extremely patient. Is that what we have been? Diana asked. There was no acidity in it, only a realistically placed curiosity. It will do, Alain said. He looked once at the hand on the mantel as if to fix it in his memory among the proofs that mattered and the proofs that didn't. Then he asked Lady Constance if she would prefer the house to sleep, and, when she inclined her head, saw them out with the same urbanity with which he had first arrived. Only now the urbanity served another end. By morning the house had learned how to keep its voice down. Even the gravel seemed to receive the departing car with discretion, and the air, rinsed by a pale rain, made the lawns appear newly ironed. Alain stood in the breakfast room where the French windows looked across the green sweep, his coffee cooling in his hand. The piano in the drawing room, visible through the open doors, had been shut and covered with a crocheted throw. A faint impression of last night's scene persisted in that polished black surface, as if sound had left its own shadow. Lady Constance came in with the measured poise of one who has rehearsed grief into something wearable. Her pearls were the same. Their cool indifference seemed useful. "Inspector," she said, with a nod that was almost impersonal, "you have been very kind." He accepted it with a small inclination. Kindness was often a word for tidiness. "You will have the house to yourself by noon, Lady Constance. My constables are making a last sweep. Superintendent Fox has gone ahead." She sat, and in the tiniest break in the facade showed as she adjusted a napkin that did not need adjusting. "They have taken her, then?" "They have," he said. "Without fuss?" It was not a question about pity, but about method. "Without fuss." Lady Constance looked toward the piano. She played in this room when we were all quite young. Everyone thought it terribly clever that Vivian could play without looking at the keys. There was a pause. One wonders which of us was most blind. Meadows, the butler, entered and removed the untouched tray of kippers with an ecclesiastical discretion. He set down a silver dish of marmalade and withdrew, having allowed his eyes for the briefest moment to rest upon the inspector. It was acknowledgment, no more, the sort men of his sort exchange when a secret has been properly folded away. Alain wandered back to the drawing-room when Lady Constance was engaged with a telegram. The room had been set to rights by invisible hands, but order carried its own betraying flaws. On the mantel, the plaster cast of a hand, an artist's model, lay palm up, the faint mark of a thumbprint still visible on the wrist where someone had seized it in a moment of fear or calculation. Beside it, the small jade figure had been returned to its shelf, green as a drop of seawater. He thought of the way Mrs. Harley's fingers had lingered on such objects, as if touch alone conferred ownership. He stood quite still, letting memory show him the room as it had been. Chairs drawn close, the thread of Chopin tying the guests together like a ribbon. Sir Reginald leaning forward with the absorbed vanity of the learned man performing knowledge. Adrian Blackwood at the bookcase, finding narrative in the spines. Miss Carstairs arranging her cigarette holder with such exactness, one almost missed her eyes. He thought, not for the first time, that an evening party, like a canvas, betrayed itself by composition. What had seemed merely decorative, an extinguished candle, a moved metronome, a letter that arrived in a hand too careful to be true, had been structure after all. Footsteps sounded behind him. Fox had returned, damp-shouldered and solid. "All in order, sir," he murmured. Warrant signed. Property list begun. The piano stool had a false bottom, not large, but enough. Alain turned the plaster hand so that its palm faced down, as if it could now rest. She will say that it was a correction, not a crime. That she meant to edit a life that had cut across hers the wrong way. Fox sighed. "People will say a great many things, sir." "Yes." He looked toward the window where the lawn reached away into its own silence. "She will be remembered here for her sonatas and her hats, and elsewhere for something that is incommensurate with hats and sonatas. It will puzzle those who prefer tidy categories." Fox, who preferred clear categories but had learned to live with the others, grunted amiably. "You'll be wanting to speak to Lady Constance again." "In a moment." He crossed to the piano and lifted the cover only an inch, enough to allow a single key to sound under his finger. An A, soft as breath. He let it fade. There was an honesty in a note dying that speech seldom achieved. In the hall, a maid was polishing the banister with small, devout circles. She glanced up as he passed, and then down again quickly. The house had returned to ritual. That was best. It would wait for narratives to settle, for talk to float out to the village and then thin in the fields. The extraordinary day would become a story told between tasks. Lady Constance was writing. She folded her letter with a firmness that suggested mastery over paper, if nothing else. "To Sir Reginald's sister," she said, "and to the trustees of the museum. There will be questions." "There usually are," Alain said, and offered the smallest of smiles. "Answers follow at their own pace." On the threshold he hesitated. "There is a habit," he said, "in houses like this, of thinking that what is not spoken is not felt. I've never found it to be true. If you will accept advice from a stranger whom you've allowed to pry, I'd suggest that music be played here again, not today, but soon." She regarded him as if weighing a prescription. "I think," she said at last, "that would be sensible." Outside, the rain had thinned to a drifting mist. The drive curved away, a pale ribbon vanishing under trees. Alain put on his hat, and as he did so, he thought of the hand on the mantel, raised last night in appeal or accusation, or practice for applause, and of the actual hand that had done what it had done with such dreadful quiet. He wondered, not for the first time, whether civilization was a matter of hands, taught to paw, to write, to strike a note, and sometimes, despite everything, to close around the wrong instrument. He walked to the car. The engine turned with a decorous hum. Behind him, the house absorbed itself, as these places do, back into its surface. The lawn took back its light, the piano its silence, and somewhere, in the interior rooms where opinion would gather and then dissipate, a new habit would begin. The measured remembrance of an evening when, in the gentlest possible way, darkness had been given a shape and a hand had moved within it.